Yeah, I hope my screen is visible now, or my PowerPoint is visible now to everybody, and you can hear me fine as well. Volume and everything is fine, right? All right. So, as promised, this is more about what I've been researching in the last 10 years or so, ever since I started my PhD in the UK in geography. I had also not done geography before, really, like many of my colleagues. But geography is a discipline that's, I think, quite. I grew up in India. I did my undergraduation there, and it's only after coming here that I actually found out more about the discipline of geography and more specifically human geography. And it is one of the things that I wish I'd had an opportunity to do back home when I was doing my undergraduation, but it's never too late, I suppose. So, so I am a geographer now. I'm a lecturer in this department. And I've been studying mostly water in its many forms in the last 10 years or so. And it's also kind of more specifically urban water, which is a bit of a strange term, I suppose, because like water is just water, right? Like you often think like what is urban about water, and it's a fair question. A lot of geographers as well as planners and engineers have written about this subject, like what is urban about water? Why do we call certain things urban water? And I hope that this talk will give you a bit of an idea of what that is and why, first of all, we might even give various adjectives to water like this, like how does water become urban or rural and so on and so forth. So the picture you see on the screen is a desalination pipeline. So it's basically a pipeline that brings water from the sea to a desalination plant. A desalination plant, I'm sure you're aware of this already, but as a word indicates quite easily, desalination means like literally taking the salt out of water. So this could mean like the literal salt that you can taste in seawater, or it can sometimes mean turbidity in wastewater and forms of water that aren't immediately potable. So the root cause for all of those is minerals that are in the water. Certain kinds of minerals, we taste them as salty, and that's what is predominant in seawater. But you also find other waters tasting salty, or other waters just being salty because they contain certain minerals. And if you're in London, if you've tried making a cup of tea, I'm sure you've seen this, that the water here is quite saline, as it were. And so many of us use various filters and so on and so forth. So desalination is really this filtering done at like a mass scale, let's say. And we've always been, humans have been trying to do desalination for quite a long time, in fact. So, and the most common way would be through evaporation, right? So the most traditional ways, like, the more ancient ways of doing this would be to evaporate seawater and then condense it. So the salt would settle down in the pan, and then you condense it in a different pan. So you get desalinated water. But of course, that's not something that can be scaled up. So now we have highly advanced filters that countries around the world, regions around the world have been using to desalinate water and hence produce potable water that they can supply to cities for people to drink and to supply for agriculture, supply for industries and so on. Supply for industries that will not work with just, saline water or with mineral water, as it is. Not mineral water as in like, the healthy mineral waters, like, minerals as in the salinity of water. So, and hence that's why this talk is titled Water Technology and the Geography of Infrastructure, because as you would have realized from the way I was describing this rather intricate and elaborate process, there's a lot of things going on here. There's, first of all, water coming from the ocean, which I'm sure is quite easily associated with geography. There's, of course, all of these technologies that we need to use, that we need to think about to figure out, how this seawater becomes something that we can drink. There's, of course, the geography of this infrastructure itself, because it's not about just the sea becoming potable water, but it's also about, like, you can see the various kinds of formations that change along the coastline for an act like this, for something like desalination to become possible. But I won't bore you with the details of desalination. At least, I'm assuming that most of you are here for a human geography talk, which is what I do mostly and not really an engineering talk. So I'm not going to go much into the engineering of this infrastructure itself, although that's what I did for my PhD. Like I spent a lot of time with the engineers who were involved in deep seawater desalination to figure out what were the kinds of social and human consideration that they really had in building these infrastructures. And I'll come to that in a bit, like why this is something that geographers are interested in. But before I go into the talk itself, just to give a broader overview of the many things that I've been looking at in the last 10 years, I said I've been looking at water in its many forms. So water isn't singular, water isn't just the thing that comes out of the tap, or water isn't just the thing that comes down as rain. We encounter it in various forms through our lives. So the top left picture that you can see there is the various kinds of household infrastructures that are usually used to access water in a place like India and many other places in the global south. So some of those are actually filtration, tanks. The blue tank, little blue tanks that you see is actually a reverse osmosis plant, which is the same thing as a desalination plant, but just in a much smaller scale. You see a storage tank in the picture. You see a water pump in the picture, and you see a water storage tank also. I mean, another water storage tank, like a rooftop water storage tank also in the picture. So there's various kinds of infrastructures that are beyond just the big pipelines and the big desalination plants. There's wetlands you see in the picture below. So that's something that I've been looking at after the PhD. So again, another form of water. But as you can see, wetlands isn't necessarily something that's there in the wild. As you can see in those wetlands, they are right in front of a huge tech park or business park that's being built, or rather the business park is being built way too close to the wetlands, or sometimes on the wetlands dangerously. You can see some migratory birds there as well. The other picture is, of course, the beach, you can see, but there's a port that's being constructed behind, and there's going to be a lot of changes that happen to the ecology of that beach, as well as to the lives of the people who, use the beach for fishing or just live around that area because of the construction of the port. So that's another strand of research I've been looking at. The last picture you see is actually, just fried fish. Because I've been doing a lot of work with coastal fishers in the last 3 or 4 years or so, I've gotten also interested in how fish plays a role in our understandings of water, especially in our understandings of the sea. So I've actually been trying to engage more with fish as food and so on and so forth as well. So as you can see, water is this thing that has enabled me to look at a wide range of things. It's enabled me to look at technology. It's enabled me to look at engineers. It's something that's enabled me to look at, how like the topology of a place changes because of port construction and so on and so forth. It's, with fishers, trying to understand more about how their lives are changing. So that's another thing. And finally, birds and fish and, non-human considerations as well, non-human animals and so on and so forth that I've been trying to understand more about through my focus on water. And I use some of this in my teaching as well, of course. As I said, this is very briefly what I've been teaching in Queen Mary Geography. So most of those are development courses. As you can see, there's one on key issues in global development, which is an undergraduate first-year course. There's a second-year course, which is, again, Spaces of Uneven Development, which goes a bit deeper into the history of development and why do we call it uneven development. There's a master's level course on global development again. And if you choose to do something like this, you will find out more about it. What are all these qualifiers you use for development as well? Why is development global or international, and what is the difference, and so on and so forth? The talk today is going to be actually bits and pieces of what I will be teaching next term in this module called Urban Water in and Beyond the Pipes. So like I said, like I just gave you an overview now, water or urban water more specifically can be many different things. Water also becomes urban water because of certain processes that we will look at now. which is what I'm hoping to be teaching students. This is based on the research that I've done, but also based on wider debates in the discipline of geography and how geographers have been engaging with water in its many forms. It is a third year module, so no worries if some of these concepts are a bit like, why are we learning all of these concepts? So they're not meant to be, they're not meant to so much, you don't have to, absorb those concepts immediately, but just think about, what are the kind of questions I'm asking when I talk about water, or what are all the, like I said, what are all the different considerations, what are all the different things that I can really learn more about through water. I'm sure you're familiar with this again, that we use water as a lens. So like, with many other conceptual lenses, we use water as a lens to look at many different things in the world. And most commonly, water is very useful in looking at what is widely understood as a concern, which is the relationship between humans and nature, or nature and society, as it's called. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go into desalination plants and water supply, and then we'll come back to this nature-society relationship there. So I grew up in South India, like I was saying, and most of my research has been based in this city of Chennai. It's one of the several really big cities of India. Really, like the older classifications, like these were the metropolitan cities, and these were the tier 2 cities are sort of disappearing now because of how rapid urbanization has been in India. So Chennai is the capital city of the state called Tamil Nadu, and it is on the coast, as you can see. It is on the coast of the Indian Ocean, but it's also on the coastline of this particular part of the Indian Ocean called the Bay of Bengal, which is a fairly turbulent ocean. So there's a lot of climatic changes that have been happening there over the years, but also more recently. So going back to the desalination plan, like I said, the key event that really was the basis for my PhD was that in July 2010, Chennai Metro Water, which is the public utility that supplies water to the city of Chennai, it opened its first, large-scale desalination plant. Like I said, cities and people have been trying to do desalination for a long time. So there have been experiments with desalination before, especially the evaporation kind. But this kind of large-scale desalination plant that's actually viable for water supply to a city, the first such plant was opened in the city of Chennai in July 2010. This was a 100 MLD desalination plant. And when you look at water supply, you often hear this word MLD, which is million liters per day. So that means that it produces 100 million liters per day of potable water. In order to produce it 100 million liters per day, it might need to take in 400 MLD of seawater, or depending on the efficiency of the plant, it might need to take in more like 200 or 800 MLD of seawater. So the first such desalination plant was built. The total network in Chennai was something like 750 MLD at that time, including the desalination plant that was built. The cost of that plant was, it's a very expensive plant. Any desalination plant, despite the advances in technology, are quite expensive. That's the point really to put in the cost there. The logic behind building a desalination plant at the time was that a city like Chennai, much like many other cities in South India or India in general, it relies quite a lot on groundwater. When we say groundwater, we're talking about water that's seeped into the ground. So underground water, really, not surface water. So it relies quite a lot on groundwater. And there's, significant groundwater reserves in most places because, over the years, we haven't really extracted all that much groundwater in deep time. But in the last 30, 40 years or so, we've been actually very efficient in extracting groundwater. We meaning not Chennai, not Tamil Nadu, not India, humankind in general. We've been quite efficient at extracting groundwater through, pumps and high-powered motors and so on and so forth. So we've actually been pretty good at exploiting all of this groundwater reserves. which means we will not be left with much groundwater very soon, however much we try to replenish it. So the argument of Chennai's engineers, the government of Tamil Nadu and so on and so forth was that desalination is something that could be more sustainable, in fact, than exploiting this, overused groundwater reserves of Chennai. But it's not, the sea is not something where there are no problems, of course. Both fishers and environmental activists who live in Chennai, who are concerned with the coastline, they've been arguing how, this is equally an unsustainable thing, because ultimately, whenever you put any kind of infrastructure on the coastline, like the port or a desalination plant, it is going to be something that will affect that coastline one way or the other. You might remember from the first slide how there are these pretty big pipes that need to come in, and there are also outlet pipes. I told you how you will need to take in maybe something like 400 mld of seawater in order to produce 100 mld of potable water, which means the remaining 300 mld has to be put back into the sea. And it is going to be processed water that goes back into the sea. So it's not necessarily the most healthy shoreline ecosystem that you're fostering there by doing this. But of course, cities in the global south have been trying so hard to ramp up their water supply so that they can become like London or Singapore or New York and so on and so forth, and have like 24 hours water supply in the tap. So there was, not only was the first desalination plant built and incorporated in the system, there was a second one built in 2013, and 2 more are under construction in Chennai now. So it's been embraced as a pretty successful solution for, water supply in the city. And I mentioned how, all of these cities want to be like London and want to have 24 hours supply. That is to say that many of these cities around the world, and not necessarily even like poor cities or cities in the global south, they often don't have 24 hours water supply in the taps, and the same 24 hours potable water supply in the tap. So that is just to explain, we in London here, we open the tap, we can use that to drink, wash, shower, etc., etc. So we use the same water for everything, because basically any water that we get in our taps has been treated to, that kind of safe level. Whereas in a place like Chennai or in many other places around the world, you wouldn't necessarily do that. You would have a separate tap for water that you use to shower, a separate tap for water that you would use to fill up your pots, so you can either boil them or filter them or drink them as such, use them in cooking and so on and so forth. And this tap, the tap that you use to fill drinking water, is often only, it would flow maybe once in 2 days or twice in a week or something like that. You need to know the times when this flows, and you need to make sure you fill up those tanks at the time. The storage tanks and the motor and everything that I showed in one of the pictures, those are all in service of that. So often people will have these infrastructures within the home. So when the water flows, you fill it up and then you can use it through the week and so on and so forth. So this is the way water has been supplied to cities for a while in, let's say, at least in the since the mid-20th century in many parts of the global south. But now there's a drive towards the same kind of water supply as in London, for example. But so it's not just a city like Chennai, which is trying to drive towards 24 hours supply, that built a desalination plant. In the same year, in fact, more or less in the same month, London also opened a desalination plant. And as you can see here, it's a bigger desalination plant than Chennai. It is 150 mLDs, 150 million liters per day. This was opened in Beckton, which is in Newham in East London. This is to be used, and London's network, as you can see, is 2.6 billion liters per day, unlike, Chennai 750 mLD. And it was also a very expensive plant, needless to say. So this was opened in 2010, and it was open not to supply water all the time to the network, but to supply only when the network runs short. So the proportion there is quite interesting. So it's 2.6 billion liters per day. And it was identified that there might be a shortage in that network. And so 150 MLD was built in as an emergency solution. So it was built in as a solution that was taken only in times of an emergency. It was also an emergency solution in the sense that desalination plants can be built quite quickly. So rather than attempt to build another reservoir or come up with other kinds of complicated infrastructures like saving wastage or like fixing leaks, this was seen as a quick way to fulfill those emergency requirements. And as you may know already, Thames Water is not a public utility, unlike Chennai Metro Water. It is a private company which is owned by international investors. So often companies like that will also try and find a solution that's cheaper. So despite being a very expensive plan, to 70 million pounds, it was still cheap, identified as cheaper than other solutions. So this was built in 2010 as well. So it's not necessarily desalination as this thing that's like a last resort of cities in the global south, which are trying very hard to achieve this kind of infrastructural completion. But they are also seen as a solution in places like London in the global north, where they're seen as things that can be built very quickly to quickly fill up gaps in the water supply, let's say. However, in London, there was a pretty strong opposition to this desalination plan from very powerful quarters, which was the then mayor of London, who called this energy guzzling. Because desalination plants, one of the things you might need to know about it is that the technology is advanced, which means that it's going to suck in a lot of energy to really do its work, as it were. So if you have to remove salt out of the ocean, then yes, that requires a lot of energy, of course. So the then mayor of London, he criticizes, he said it's energy guzzling and that it diverts attention from the leakages and wastage in the distribution pipes, which actually London is quite famous for. So I think we have a leakage of 25% or something like that, which is quite high for a city in the global north. So, and Thames Water is always fined for these leakages, but like I said, it's a big private company, so the fines aren't big enough for Thames Water to really take them seriously. Or rather, the expenses they will incur by fixing those leaks are often much higher than the annual fines that they will have to pay. So this is what happened. But then there was a change of mayor at that time and the plant went ahead because of that. The plant also went ahead because Thames Water closed a deal for biofuel plant in Beckton. They started advertising this desalination plant as something that was 100% fueled by renewable energy. But as Professor Sarah Bell said in her article in The Londonist, you can just look up Professor Sarah Bell Londonist if you want, and desalination in London. It's like running a marathon, so you can eat cheesecake for breakfast, right? It might seem like something that will balance it out, but ideally you should be running a marathon in order to be healthy with the food that you eat, not so you eat something extravagant like cheesecake for breakfast. Like that, to build a desalination plant and then to fuel it using renewable energy is not really a sustainability credential, because you might as well use that biofuel plant for something else that you already have rather than this new, highly energy intensive infrastructure that you've built in. So these were the kind of debates that happened in London at the time it was built. But we do have a desalination plant in London now, which supplies whenever the Thames Water network runs out of, not runs out of water, whenever the Thames Water identifies that there's a shortage in water supply. Just so you know, London also relies quite heavily on groundwater. But because of the concerns with replenishing of groundwater, there are often like regulations as to how much they can extract. So when they reach that level, when they can't extract anymore, that's when they turn on this plant, for example. So don't know, I did on this summer, for example. So, but whenever there is something like a hosepipe ban, which we had this summer, they will normally be authorized to turn on something like the desalination plant and use its energy. Use energy to run it, basically. So that's the way the desalination plant in London has been working. So the question then that we ask is, I've explained a lot of different things about desalination plants. This all was a bit like, to me, even saying all of this feels a bit like I'm delivering a lecture on engineering. Why is this important in geography? Like, why am I what am I interested in all of this as a geographer? So one question I might ask actually is, how can desalination be called sustainable in one place but not in another? Right? Like, of course, yeah, there are difference in terms of weather conditions in the two places. Chennai is, of course, a tropical city, and London is, this city on a river, which is definitely not tropical, as we know now. So why is desalination, but why would it be sustainable in a tropical city, but not here, according to the logic of engineers at least? So is it only dependent on things like rainfall and weather conditions in each place? Oh, I know that I mentioned that this was built in Beckton, which is obviously not on the sea. So what it extracts, what this desalination plant uses is water in the brackish side of the Thames. So if you know, Thames is a river that's tidal in the east, and there's a certain point at which it stops being tidal and it's a freshwater river. So basically, Thames water is extracting water from the tidal part of the Thames to run its desalination plant. So it's brackish water that it is extracting rather than seawater as such. Anyway, so is it only dependent on rainfall and weather conditions in each place that we call one as sustainable and one as another? Or is it because of something like, oh, London can afford to think about environmental sustainability because, it's a rich city and it's in a rich country. So it can afford to think about all of these things like, abstraction limits on groundwater or sustainability of its technologies, and a developing country can't? Is that one of the considerations? But then that raises a question of, if London is, so rich and it has this perfect infrastructure, why did it need an emergency installation in the first place? So it should have been a city that would have been able to plan things well in advance and make sure that it would not need to install this very quick fix solution like desalination as an emergency, especially. Then that brings us to the question of, maybe it's not an emergency installation. Are we looking at the future really when we are thinking about desalination? Are we thinking about the ocean as something that really has this promise for a future? So we talked about how there is over abstraction of groundwater, how there's various changes in climatic conditions. Of course, we are all aware of climate change. So is the ocean where we need to turn to in order to continue living our future in our cities, in villages, wherever, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the questions I might be asking as a geographer when I look at something like this. And what would I do to try and answer these questions? We will look at that now. So before we go into, how we might look at the background of these things, desalination is something that's been used pretty widely around the world now. There are a lot of different countries and places, some expected, some unexpected, which are building desalination plants. I don't know if you identify many of the countries there, but there is some, things that we might expect, like Saudi Arabia. Everyone says always that Saudi Arabia is a desert. Of course, they build desalination plants there. Some in North Africa, some in Spain, so southern Spain. So these are places that we might think of as, oh, of course, they are short of water, so they will, of course, try and make seawater potable in those places. But like we just saw, there's also London, which we don't think of as a desert really. There's also Chennai, which is definitely not as a desert, as we will see in a minute. These have also been building desalination plants. There's this dot here, which I think might be Singapore, but at any rate, Southeast Asia, again, not a desert, tropical rainforest really. So why are all of these places also building desalination plants? And I think one of these might be the Amazon. Anyway, again, probably not a desert. So why are all of these places also building these desalination plants? One of the answers for that often is global business. So this is a map produced by someone named Eric Swingadow, who is like quite a big name in the geographies of water. So he has been looking at desalination quite consistently since 2013, that is. And he's been looking at how Spanish companies in particular, because, southern Spain was a place which required desalination plans, they developed technology. They don't get good going around exporting this technology everywhere because that's a way for them to make money. So this is, one of the many theses that Eric Spingardow has put forth with respect to desalination plants. So this is a map of everywhere in the world where Spanish companies in particular build desalination plants. So as you can see from the previous map to this map, there's actually quite a lot of points from the previous map which actually are the same in this map. So much of the global spread of desalination can in fact be traced back to Spain. Even in Chennai, it was a Spanish company which originally built this desalination plants. But they've gotten out of the business now. I don't think they've been very with using desalination as a business model. But anyway, this article is from 2013. It's been 10 years since then. So yeah, there's a lot of things that have changed since then, of course. So this is one way in which geographers try to consider how environmental change is happening, how there is various technologies that we are using to access resources in the environment. So the way being that, it's basically business or money that drives all of these things. So that's been the thesis that someone like Eric Spingardow, who looks at water from this view of how money drives water, or rather how capital drives water. I'm sure you are probably introduced to this idea of capitalism. So how capitalism drives how water is supplied or how water is channeled is something someone like Eric Spingardow would look at. The broad school of thought that this comes under is political ecology. We will look at that as a separate concept in a few slides down now. But there's also, before we get to the political ecology point, why are we asking all of these questions? The city needs water, so we're building water infrastructure. Why are we asking all of these questions about why are you building infrastructure? I mean, not in support of development, as it were. This is often a question that's asked whenever there is someone who tries to critically look at building infrastructures, especially in the global south, but also in the global north increasingly now. So why am I critical of this? Why am I thinking about this as with like a suspicious question mark in my mind? And you may be aware that there have been debates like this about other infrastructures in the past, right? Like dams or big canals, big irrigation projects, and so on and so forth. So, but why are we making these? Why are we asking these questions in this rather suspicious manner at all? So one of the reasons why we do this is because, once again, geographers in their study have identified something called construction of scarcity. So these images are from the city of Chennai, again, from 2019, when there was what was identified as a pretty big drought. Images like this were circulating in the global media. These are both from this Guardian article. And as you can see, the Guardian article is extremely apocalyptic. It says our whole life is disrupted. Hope dries up, it says, as Chennai battles historic drought. So it's like a pretty amped up description of what was happening at Chennai at that time. So Chennai goes through these cycles of so-called droughts and floods often, but this particular case in 2018-19, it really captured international attention because it was also the time when international media were quite keen on finding all of these places where climate change was being reflected. So this was very quickly attributed to climate change in the global media. And images like this, which show like an absolutely parched earth or like, scores of people waiting with their many pots for water from a truck. These kinds of images sort of circulated in the global media. So why am I calling this a construction of scarcity? This looks like a pretty dire situation, right? Like why am I critical of this too? It's because, okay, before we go there, just to let you know, before we move to the next slide, these kinds of images are not exceptional. These kinds of images aren't specific to droughts. So if you lived in Chennai, you would know that, something like this, something, like many people waiting for water from trucks, it's not specific to a drought, but it is more specific to poverty, or it is more specific to a situation where you cannot afford to build tanks inside your house. So you will need to necessarily wait for water supply. So even in times of abundance, even in times of floods for that matter, there would still be people queuing up for water. This kind of past state situation is actually quite interesting because the reason why Chennai goes through these cycles of drought and floods is because it is a kind of tropical ecology where you would have land like this, which goes fallow at certain times during the year. And then there are other times during the year when rain falls and it would actually store water. This land would absorb water to go underneath. So the kind of well springs that these women are fetching water from, those are precisely the kind of well springs they would rely on every summer, let's say. And in every winter now, it's rainfall season in Chennai, it's getting, there's again news of floods and so on and so forth. A similar process was underway in London as well. I mentioned how this desalination plant was built in 2010 in London. It was only in 2007 that the Environment Agency had published this map about the UK, about England and Wales in specific, because water supply in the UK is specific to England and Wales. Scotland has its own supply structures. So as you can see here, London and the southeast were classified as seriously water stressed in 2007. There was a lot of panic around how London and the southeast will continue to sustain their water supply at that time. And so that was when something like the desalination plant, it was in 2006 specifically that the desalination plant was proposed. And by 2010, it was opened despite mayoral opposition to it, like I said. So Maria Kaika, who's another geographer who's well known for looking at water, she calls this, the construction of scarcity. So she says that nature is often constructed as this threat over which we need to take emergency measures to deal with it and continue surviving in it. And even the climate change discourses that we hear today often sometimes go dangerously into that territory where they talk about it as this is the most serious problem that's ever facing us, and there's no other problem that we need to look at. I mean, yes, climate change is a threat. Of course, we need to be mindful of how nature works and deal with it, but to always think about it as, so this is an emergency, so we need to tackle it and build some advanced infrastructure, irrespective of the cost or irrespective of the energy that we might need to actually construct this emergency measure. She uses the example of Athens to do this. I mean, it's an interesting article which talks about, once again, a very specific period in the history of Athens when something like this happened. But I'm also putting in here that is it only a construction of scarcity or is it also a construction of abundance? Because unlike in Chennai, where all of these images keep circulating all the time, the stereotype about London is that, we have too much water, right? It's too wet all the time. It's too wet and gray all the time. So many of us actually don't even know that we have something like a desalination plant. Many of us don't even know that, there were these times when London was seriously water stressed. There were hosepipe bans, of course, but many of us in London also don't live with big gardens, so we often don't have use for hosepipes. So we're not easily made aware of the fact that we might also be living in a fairly water stressed area. So one of the things that we don't know about London, I mean, it's not common knowledge about London, is that we actually don't receive very much rainfall. So if I mentioned that article by Sarah Bell in the Londonist. So London is a fairly dry city by global comparisons, because although we get a lot of, we have incessant rain, the rain doesn't have enough volume to really seep through and replenish our groundwater reserves. Unlike a place like Chennai, where tropical rain means that water will seep right through. Even if it's just a few days of rain, the volumes would be copious. The other important factor that leads to this is that London is fairly built up, right? Unlike urbanism elsewhere, there are a lot of places which are paved in London. So even when there's rain, there's not a lot of scope for water to really seep through underground. And now that's why we have various things like sustainable urban drainage systems. They're actually trying to take out some of these pavements. Some of the pavements, for example, in our back gardens and so on and so forth, so water can seep in and sort of replenish our groundwater reserves. So water, rainfall and weather conditions aren't necessarily the only thing that determine how how cities deal with water, or the status of water supply in many cities around the world. Another example of this is, once again, going back to Chennai. Despite all of those apocalyptic images of parched earths and so on and so forth, Chennai is a city that's actually like this in revenue maps. Much of it is water bodies. Many of these water bodies have, of course, been built up now. Precisely like I said, when there's a parched earth situation, those kinds of lands are immediately classified as wastelands, and they're acquired by urban governments. And this is a process that started during the colonial time, when, whenever there was a parched land like this, it was considered waste and it was built over. Whenever there was a water body which wasn't directly, supplying water to, say, agriculture or something like that, it was once again called wasted water. In fact, it was seen as unsanitary water, and that also be drained and built over often. So Rohan D'Souza, another, I don't know if he's a geographer actually, but he has done a lot of research on water in India, who identifies colonialism as something that fundamentally changed the way people related to water and land in a place like India. And this is, of course, true not just in India, but in many parts of Southeast Asia, Africa, and so on and so forth as well. So we've identified capital and now colonialism, both as factors that could affect the way, we relate to water, or human societies relate to water, or specific societies relate to water and nature. Coming back once again, it wasn't always, we discussed how London is a city where you can just open the tap and you can use that water for anything and everything. But it wasn't always like that, right? It was only in the early 20th century that such a system really came into place. And even then, it wasn't obvious to planners immediately that this was the best way to go about things. And in fact, something like intermittent water supply or non-universal water supply, let's say one tap for drinking water and one tap showering, all of these were considered. But eventually it was decided that constructing something like a seamless or hidden infrastructure was quite essential to a modern city like London. And similar processes were underway in Paris, in Germany, in cities in North America, and so on and so forth. So Matthew Gandy, another well-known geographer who's done this kind of work in New York to show how there needed to be a particular set of processes that happened. A lot of money pumped in, a lot of water and nature extracted from the hills around New York to really make New York the kind of modern city that it is right now. So New York is a city that he says has been sculpted through the flow of water and the flow of money. So water, even though it's not something that you would see out in the open like in Chennai, in a place like New York or London, it really is something that flows onto the city, as in not just in terms of pipes, but literally as something that keeps the city sustaining, right? So that's why this often constantly this comparison of water to money in all of these writings. And that's what makes water uniquely urban in this case as well. It's not the same as water that's just flowing, in a river or in the sea and so on and so forth. So these are the ways in which geographers have really tried to look at how, how human societies, specifically urban societies, urban spaces, what is their relationship to water. And one overarching thesis that everyone seems to agree on is that there is an attempt to construct what are seamless infrastructures. And when we say seamless, we mean that most people shouldn't know about their existence until they break down. Right? We get to know about them only when they break down. Like, for instance, until we had an energy crisis, we did not really know much about where our energy was coming from and so on and so forth. And we are finding out about it in sort of the worst way possible right now. And a similar thing could happen with water very soon. And an emergency infrastructure like desalination is built precisely so, this never becomes seamed, as it were, so that in order to maintain that seamlessness, in order to maintain that hidden nature of infrastructures, the word infrastructures literally means, structures underneath. So to keep them hidden, that is precisely why suddenly there's something like emergency installations done, so that we never have to stop just opening the tap and getting water that we can use for all kinds of things. So another book that really does a good, overview of all of this, traces it historically, is by Emma Jones, who was in Queen Mary before. She's not here anymore. It's called Scarcity. Is one of the few books that really looks at the history of how water was water was made into infrastructure in London and in the UK. So what are some of the concepts that we've been looking at? So we've asked the question, what mediates the relationship between water and people? Or more, broadly speaking, what are the kinds of things that really mediates the relationship between nature and society? We've seen that it could be about capital, it could be about money, but it can also be about colonialism. It can also be about gender and race, which we haven't really, obviously we can't cover in everything now. So one of the theories that really looks at one of the geographical ideas that really considers this is political ecology. It is, as it says, it is about the politics of ecology. We don't take things as just political ecology, doesn't take things as just natural. It doesn't take it that, oh, there's higher waterfall, a higher rainfall, so automatically this place would be wet or not. It will also look at what are the other kinds of political processes that have happened to really make this ecology the way it is. Equally, it's not just about how politics produces nature, but it is also about how nature is used to produce space, like urban space. Like Matthew Gandhi said, without the nature around New York, you wouldn't really have a modern city like New York. How it is used to produce wilderness, in fact, how it is used to produce agricultural commodities, etc., etc. So the offshoot from that has been infrastructure studies, or the geographies of infrastructure, which really unpacks what infrastructure means. Like I said, if infrastructure is literally what is the structure underneath, then as social scientists, we do have to look at how are these structures built, meaning not just the materials behind them, but also the kind of social processes that have gone to build these structures. But we've also been trying to think about materiality, because often it is at how much human beings and money and capital tries to mold nature. You would often find that nature isn't easily cooperative to you. And that's what Karen Backer's thesis is. She's a Canadian geographer who's been looking at how water is an uncooperative commodity. Finally, science and technology studies, which is a separate discipline, but quite used quite widely within geography, looks at how it's not just materials, not just natural materials, but also technologies and engineering that humans have done. How do they become ultimately things that we may not have much control over, right? So however much we try to, for instance, tame nature, often it turns out that there are floods and droughts and now climate change, which comes back to bite us. So we are unable to have this kind of hold over nature. And that's why we are concerned with ideas of materiality. And that's what Karen Becker sort of means by calling water an uncooperative commodity as well. Finally, going back to my question of why does all of this matter to us? How does it affect us? Or to put it in another way, is the ocean the answer to the urban needs of the present, not to mention the future? Some of the questions we might ask as critical geographers, critical social scientists is, who is the us here? Are we talking about you and me in London, or are we talking about people in Chennai? Within London or within Chennai, who are we referring to? So for instance, the picture there is of fishers in Chennai who live and work on spaces that we might consider as the beach, as spaces of only leisure. So for them, the ocean is not something that is just lying there waste for us to be used, for us to use it as converted to drinking water and so on and so forth. It is something that they use already for their everyday life. It is a space which is already meaningful to them. So how are we to say, who are we to say that the ocean is something that will constitute our future? And this is also what, again, going back to geographer Eric Stringadow, this is what is called a terrestrial fix or a scalar fix, or for us to understand more easily, it's a techno fix or a techno solutionism, where we just think, oh, if we quickly put in a technology somewhere, that will solve our problems. And by saying a terrestrial fix, we mean that, we are used to thinking that land is all that matters and the ocean is just there lying out there. Whereas we need to also, as geographers, we've also started asking the question of, but is the ocean really like that? How isn't it just as complicated as land or more, if anything? Thank you for your patience in listening to this talk. Okay, so we're nearly at 5 p.m. now. Any questions? Do we have any questions from the students here? Or we can also, wait for questions after Sophia explains what she wants to. She has a presentation as well, I think, right? Shall I stop sharing and Sophia can share?
That'll be great, Nina.
Yeah.
Yeah, feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A function regarding the talk, or if you want to ask more general questions about our courses or student life, Sophia will be able to answer those for you. So whenever you're ready. Sophia, maybe, yeah, you can share your screen and maybe introduce yourself and your courses, and then hopefully we'll get a couple questions coming in.
It's not coming up, so I quickly need to close it and open it again. No. It's not coming up on my sharing section for some reason. It was working earlier. Okay, there we go.
They're working now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see your PowerPoint.
Okay, so hi everyone. Just in case you missed at the beginning, my name is Sophia and I'm an MSc Water and Environmental Management student. And I completed my undergraduate at Queen Mary as well in BSc Physical Geography. And for my A levels, I did chemistry, biology, geography, and AS physics. And so I was going to say, so for my A levels, because I was quite interested in not just geography and science, I was thinking about, well, at first I was thinking of going into something like biochemistry or biological sciences, but then I really thought about it and I'm like, okay, if I did geography or environmental science, then I can really get the best of everything that I'm really interested in. So for me, I really knew that they encompassed everything I like. And so I went on to do that at uni for my undergraduate. But I would really recommend that you take the time to carefully think about what it is that you want to do as an undergraduate and what's required of you academically for any future careers that you're essentially interested in. Yeah. And so if anyone has any specific questions, you can raise your hand or pop it in the chat, but I have a few prompts here to just go through to kind of get the discussion going. And so the first question is about what's the difference between A-level studies and university studies? So depending on your learning style, the transition from sixth form to university may vary, but it does not take too long to adjust to the new methods of teaching. And you may experience, there are loads of different ways to get used to it. So in your first year especially, you receive a lot of extra help. Everyone will have tutorial groups where they will have weekly kind of discussions with their tutor and a few other students to go over readings and develop essays and form like drafts to really refine your university level writing skills. And this really does help, especially if you're not familiar with, writing essays at a university level, especially if you come from not studying many essay-based subjects. And so you'll also be assigned an academic advisor. This is someone, a member of staff that you can arrange meetings with, and you can kind of discuss anything from, any academic problems you may be having or any pastoral issues. So make the most of that if you do end up joining us at Queen Mary. And to move on to the second question, so what made me join Queen Mary? So I would say at the time when I was applying, Queen Mary ranked first in London for physical geography, so that really stood out to me. And I also really like the research areas that the academics specialise in. So usually you wouldn't associate many of the topics that you do at university with the topics that you do at A-level, because and there's a very big difference, and it's a lot more interesting at university, say if you're finding that the A-level curriculum is quite limited. And so for me, when I started, I was really shocked by how varied the different subjects are. So you can be studying anything from, I did kinship with you, Catherine, in third year, And, you know, in second year I did paleoecology, and you can do geomorphology. So it's really varied and it's quite interesting. So I really recommend studying at Queen Mary, because they have loads of different things you can study. And then things I'm most excited for about this year. So I'm going to be working on a student staff research project next term. It's a chance for you to kind of collaborate with a member of staff on a research project. And this is really helpful if you're interested in pursuing research in the future after your degree, or if you want to do a PhD. So yeah, it gives you the really good research experience, and when you're applying, you can have something to talk about in terms of having research experience. And the dissertation is also really good, even though it is in your third year and you guys are in sixth form and it's quite a way off. It's something to start thinking about in terms of, you know, when you're doing your different modules over the next few years, you can start maybe narrowing down what you're interested in, and you can start doing some reading for it. But that's always something to look forward to. And so a typical day for me during term time. So it depends on what classes I have that day. Usually you have pre-reading to do before your class, so you can complete any work that you need to kind of get done before the lecture, so you can kind of understand what's going on. And then anything else that needs to be done, because I'm a commuter student, I'm not based on on campus. So sometimes, you know, on the train you can recap your notes or do some extra reading before you get to campus if you're doing that. And if you have any time before class, you can go to the cafe on campus or the library to meet a friend or to do any work that you have. But it's really varied day to day. You have time during the week to get on with your own self-study, and it's not as rigid as the 5-period day that you have at school at the moment. So that's something to look forward to. You can organise your time yourself. But yeah, and sometimes, you know, you have time to go to the gym between classes or something like that. So yeah, that's nice. Okay, and how do you think the programme is preparing you for your future career? Okay, so there are modules, especially during, so for me at the moment, I have a whole module that lasts the entire year that focuses on career development in water and environmental, in the water environmental sector. But more specifically, in your first year, you'll take a module about professional skills, and you'll complete activities such as creating career ladders, researching different job opportunities, and producing mock CVs, and covering letters for jobs. And these will be marked and you'll receive feedback. So it's really helpful, especially at the beginning. You're really told to think about what you want to be doing with a degree, and you're also told what you could be doing with it as well. Okay. And what was my favourite module in first year? Okay, so this might sound a bit strange, but for me it was environmental research methods. Everyone hates statistics. It's something they just don't really like. And it's really important regardless of whether you're a BA or a BSc student. The module is for both streams of study, so everyone will learn qualitative and quantitative techniques. And this module really changed it. Alistair, who used to be the head of the school, taught this module when I was in first year. And it's a really important module that you should be taking. Well, you're going to take it if you do the degree. And what do I enjoy most about living in London? So you have the whole of London at your doorstep. You can go to festivals, events, music, events, museums, exhibitions. There's everything really. And there are cafes everywhere, so you can get a drink and go and get some work done. And sometimes the most productive work can be done, you know, at a cafe. It doesn't always have to be at a library. And yeah, so that's always really good. And any wisdom about studying geography? So always reach out to staff. They're really kind and approachable. They're really friendly. Build really good relationships with them so you can, you know, talk to them about any issues you might be having. They might help out with any like research opportunities that you could be doing. And they're also going to be your referees for when you're applying for further study or any job. So make sure you build a really good relationship with them and get the most out of your time at university, as it will go really quickly. So I just finished the undergraduate. It went extremely quickly, especially because of COVID. But yeah, it was really good, but it'll go very quickly. And so in 3 words to describe the school, I would say friendly, stimulating and outstanding. I had a really good experience as an undergraduate in the School of Geography, and that's me. I tried to go through that really quickly, sorry. Yeah, but that's me done.
Thanks so much, Sophia. Yeah, like I said before, if you have any questions, do pop them into the chat box. We don't have any currently. Catherine, do you have any questions for Nina or Sophia?
Yeah, thank you, Sophia, for your helpful talks. Really great to hear that you had such a good time, and sounds like things are going really well. Thank you for that. That's really useful for us and for the students listening. I did have a question for Nina. I was just thinking about you're focusing on big corporations who are doing desalination plants and the wider issues around the privatisation of water, things that the government used to supply in the UK without citizens paying, and now we have to pay for it to private companies. But I wonder if there's any work, and I'm sure there is, but I'd be interested to hear a little bit about it, of people trying to bypass the sort of corporate provision and bypass the private utility companies by gathering water themselves, reusing water in the household, just all the sort of alternative things people might be doing to resist the system that means you have to buy it, basically.
Thanks, Catherine, for that question. So I actually haven't done much work on like the privatization as such. So because I was just trying to show what others have done, really. But the interesting thing about water in the UK or England and Wales has also been that unlike energy, the water companies have actually not been allowed to charge as much. So they can't charge like market value. There's like a whole bunch of regulations through which how much you charge is, really controlled. Now, once again, it's interesting because of these droughts and because of, the water stress classifications that London is in now, water companies are now being allowed to install meters. Many of our houses still don't have meters. And if we don't have a meter, we don't pay for what we use. We only pay based on the size of your house and so on and so forth. That is part of the essentially the danger is that in the future it might, environmental stress, water stress, and it's also often presented an argument towards, better environment, then we will use lesser of it. But the interesting thing about that is you asked how are the people who are bypassing it. It's quite difficult to bypass it in a place like London because there aren't very many other ways in which you can modify the infrastructure. It's really expensive even to modify little things in your bathroom. So we don't have a lot of agency to resist it in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I guess it depends very much again. Sorry, just saying it very much depends on the rural or urban context, what country you're talking about in terms of what people can do, just gathering rainwater or reusing household water and so on. Yes, so very geographical in that sense as well. Thank you.
Sorry, there was a question in the chat. Max Homel asked, did you have the opportunity to also study abroad? I think that would be to Sophia.
I'm not quite sure about the options for studying abroad. There are field trips that usually happen, but because of COVID, most things were cancelled. But most fieldwork trips are now back on, so that's something to look forward to. There are really good fieldwork trips. But yeah.
Sorry, our cats can't go out now because one of them has an infection and they're supposed to stay indoors. So they're being very angsty. One just tried to get on it. That's why I've been trying to manage that on the side. Can I ask a question to Sophia? I see that your degree was on water and environmental management. I'm assuming it's more like a physical geography degree, or did you have a bit of physical and human, because I think water is something that allows you to do a bit of both if you're interested. So, yeah.
So my undergraduate was physical geography. I did a BSc in physical geography, and now I'm doing a master's in water and environmental management. But yeah, it's purely science for the most part. Yeah. But as you said, there is scope for human stuff as well in Yeah.
Because I see that I mentioned that this urban water module that I'm doing next term, I see that quite a few people who have registered, quite a few students who've registered are from the physical geography side. So I think it'll be really interesting to use things like the environment and water to not make, geography really gives that scope, right? It has both physical and human in it, so you can bring those two together.
Definitely, yeah. Even at the moment with a module that I'm doing, catchment science in practice, today I had a class about citizen science, and it's kind of engaging both, how you can use the social element of science, practicing science, and how you can bring that into creating really large data sets and pools of knowledge to, to work out different problems relating to water and to kind of find solutions using crowdsourcing and that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to say that we've got very flexible degree programs where you could do different bits. Really, if you come in on a BSc or a BA, you can tailor your program. So Sophia did one of my options as human geography module in third year, which is quite unusual in some ways, but really open to students from different programs. So it's unusual in that we have quite a flexible structure. So you could be mixing things up, or you can go down particular lines, which is good to highlight. I mean, I did geography, chemistry and biology too as A-levels a long time ago, but became a human geographer. So you start off in different ways and you can take your own pathways through things. And I think obviously geography connects these things so well, thinking about the environment and society. We do a lot of work in those integrated modules in the first year particularly. Yeah,
in first year you have to take a number of human and physical regardless of what you do, so you really get to have a go at everything. Yeah.
So if you're thinking about university, it's worth sort of checking on what flexibility there is in the degree programs.
Some degrees don't have, they don't give you the opportunity to kind of explore different topics, and they're very rigid. Even with optional modules, you sometimes can't choose any of them at all. So with other unis, so yeah, something to look out for.